The biting cold of the Wyoming winter clawed at Lillian Walker's skin as she struggled through knee-deep snow, her thin coat providing little protection against the howling blizzard. The mail-order bride contract clutched in her frozen fingers was now nothing more than a sodden promise, the ink running in rivulets down the page like her dwindling hopes. Night was falling fast, and with it, her chances of survival. Lillian had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston to meet her future husband, only to find no one waiting at the Clearwater station when the train arrived. Now lost in the vast emptiness of the frontier, she could barely see through the curtain of white that surrounded her. Her legs were growing numb, her strength failing with each labored step. "Hello," she called again, her voice swallowed by the wind. "Is anyone there?" A sob caught in her throat as she stumbled forward, her trunk abandoned miles back at the station. All she had now was the small carpet bag clutched to her chest, containing her most precious possessions. Her mother's Bible, a photograph of her parents, and the letters from Franklin Lawson, the man who had promised her a life of security in exchange for becoming his wife. As darkness descended completely, Lillian fell to her knees. The cold had seeped into her bones, and exhaustion pulled at her like quicksand. She was going to die here, alone in this God-forsaken wilderness, without ever having known true love. Then she heard the sound of hoofbeats, faint but growing louder. "Over here!" she cried, mustering what little strength remained. "Please help me!" Through the veil of snow emerged a massive dark shape, a horse with a rider, materializing like an apparition from the storm. The figure dismounted, a tall silhouette moving toward her. "Madam, what in God's name are you doing out here?" The man's voice was deep, rough with concern. "I'm lost," Lillian managed, her teeth chattering violently. "The train? Nobody was there. My fiancé." Without another word, strong arms swept beneath her, lifting her frozen form from the snow. The man's face was mostly hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a woolen scarf, but she caught a glimpse of intense blue eyes surveying her with concern. "You're half frozen," he said, carrying her toward his horse. "The ranch is about a mile from here. I'll get you warm." "My bag," she whispered, clutching it desperately. The stranger shifted her weight to one arm with surprising ease and retrieved her carpet bag with his free hand. "I've got it. Hold on to me now." He lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, wrapping his heavy coat around them both. His chest was solid and warm against her back, his arms secure around her as he took the reins. Lillian felt consciousness slipping away as the horse began moving through the blinding snow. "Stay with me, madam," the man urged, his breath warm against her ear. "What's your name?" "Lillian," she mumbled. "Lillian Walker." "I'm Franklin Lawson," he replied, guiding the horse confidently through the whiteout. "You just hold on, Miss Walker. I'm taking you home." As darkness claimed her, Lillian had one last coherent thought. She'd come all this way to meet a stranger named Franklin Lawson, and somehow, in the midst of a deadly blizzard, he had found her instead. When Lillian next opened her eyes, warmth enveloped her. She lay beneath thick quilts before a crackling fire in a simple but sturdy log cabin. Her wet clothes had been removed, replaced with an oversized flannel shirt that smelled of pine and horse and man. Confusion clouded her mind as she struggled to piece together how she'd gotten here. "You're awake," she turned toward the voice. The man from the storm. Franklin stood in the doorway holding a steaming mug. Without his hat and scarf, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected from his letters, perhaps 30, with a strong jawline darkened by stubble and those same striking blue eyes that had peered at her through the blizzard. His brown hair was thick and unruly, in need of a trim. "How long have I been asleep?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Nearly a day." He approached cautiously and offered the mug. "Broth. You need to get something warm inside you." Lillian struggled to sit up, holding the blankets to her chest. "My clothes. Had to get you out of them." A flush crept up his neck. "You were soaked through. Would have caught your death. I didn't look more than necessary, Miss Walker. Your modesty's intact." She accepted the mug with trembling hands. "You're Franklin Lawson?" He nodded, pulling a chair closer to the bed, but maintaining a respectful distance. "And you're the woman who answered my advertisement." "You weren't at the station," she said, unable to keep the accusation from her voice. Franklin ran a hand through his hair. Train wasn't due until tomorrow. Got the dates mixed up in my letter, I reckon. Never expected you to arrive in the middle of the worst blizzard we've had in 10 years. He leaned forward, forearms resting on his thighs. What possessed you to leave the station in that storm? Lillian sipped the broth, letting the warmth spread through her. The station master said there was a town just over the ridge. I thought I could find lodging there for the night. Clearwater's 5 miles from the station, Franklin said, shaking his head, and in the opposite direction from where I found you. Shame heated Lillian's cheeks. I've never seen snow like this. In Boston, it's different. I got turned around. You're lucky to be alive. His tone was matter of fact, not unkind. Another hour out there, and I'd be digging a grave come spring thaw. The brutal honesty of his words made Lillian shiver despite the fire's heat. Thank you for finding me. Franklin stood and moved to stoke the fire. Wasn't looking for you. Was bringing the horses in before the worst of the storm hit. You were just... He paused. Providence, I suppose. Providence. The word hung between them, laden with meaning. Lillian studied him as he worked the broad shoulders, the capable hands, the set of his jaw. This was the man she'd traveled across the country to marry, a man she knew only through a handful of carefully penned letters. Your advertisement said you needed a wife to help run your ranch, she said softly. Is this it? Franklin glanced around the modest cabin with its simple furnishings. This is just the line shack. Main house is another 2 miles. Can't get there till the storm breaks. He met her gaze directly. But yes, I have a ranch. 600 acres, 20 head of cattle. Nothing fancy, but it's mine, free and clear. And you still want a wife? The question escaped before she could stop it. Something flickered in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps. Or an emotion she couldn't name. Reckon that depends. On what? On whether you still want to be one, after nearly dying to get here. His voice had softened slightly. And on whether you're the woman I thought I was writing to. Lillian set the empty mug aside. I didn't lie in my letters, Mr. Lawson. Neither did I. He moved toward the door. But letters aren't people. Get some rest. We're stuck here at least another day. He paused, hand on the doorframe. I'll sleep in the lean-to with the horses. Mr. Lawson, she called as he was about to leave. May I have my bag? He nodded toward a corner where her carpet bag sat. Already brought it in, and it's Frank. Only the bank and the tax man call me Mr. Lawson. With that, he was gone, leaving Lillian alone with the crackling fire and the howling wind outside. She closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her back toward sleep, wondering what kind of future awaited her with this solemn, taciturn man who had saved her life. Morning brought weak sunlight filtering through frosted windows. Lillian woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Her body ached, but the deathly cold had receded. She found her dress and undergarments hanging near the fire, dry but wrinkled. After dressing quickly beneath the blankets, she made her way on unsteady legs to the main room of the cabin. Franklin stood at a cast-iron stove, his back to her. He'd shaved, she noticed, and his hair was damp, as if he'd washed in melted snow. Good morning, she said softly. He turned, spatula in hand. You should be resting. I've rested enough. Lillian moved closer to the warmth of the stove. I thought I might help with breakfast. Franklin eyed her pale face and trembling hands. Sit. You're still weak. There was no arguing with his tone, so Lillian took a seat at the small wooden table. The cabin was larger than it had seemed from her sickbed, one main room with a stove, table, and 2 chairs, a few shelves with provisions, and the bedroom she'd occupied. Simple but solid, like the man who stood before her. Do you live here alone? She asked as he placed a tin plate of eggs and bacon before her. At the main house, yes. He poured coffee into a chipped mug. Had a ranch hand, old-timer named Pete, but he passed last winter. Pneumonia. Lillian bowed her head briefly. I'm sorry. Franklin shrugged, but she could see the loss still weighed on him. Been managing on my own since. Not easy, especially with winter coming on. That's why you advertise for a wife. He met her gaze steadily. Part of it. They ate in silence for a few minutes before Lillian found the courage to ask, what was the other part? Franklin set his fork down. Gets lonely out here. Man wasn't meant to live without companionship. His directness was unsettling. But I won't lie to you, this isn't an easy life. Days are long, winters are harsh, and there's always more work than hours to do it. I didn't come west expecting luxury, Lillian replied. My father was a bookkeeper, but I helped my mother with the boarding house we ran. I know hard work. City work and ranch work ain't the same. No, she agreed, but I can learn. I'm not afraid of difficulty, Mr. Frank. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Good, because difficulty's one thing the frontier has in abundance. He stood and carried his plate to a basin of water. Storm's letting up. If it holds, we'll head to the main house tomorrow. And then? Franklin paused, his back to her. And then we see if what we agreed to in those letters still stands. The prospect hung between them, the arranged marriage, the practical partnership they'd negotiated through correspondence. Sitting in this small cabin with the man who was to be her husband, Lillian realized how little she truly knew him. Tell me about your ranch, she said, changing the subject. For the next hour, Franklin described his land, the creek that ran through the south pasture, the stand of cottonwoods where he'd built the main house, the challenges of raising cattle in Wyoming territory. As he spoke, animation crept into his voice, his hands sketching the landscape in the air. This was a man who loved his land, who had poured his soul into carving something from nothing. My father came out here in '59, he explained. Had a dream of raising horses, died in '67, arrow through the chest during a Cheyenne raid. I'm sorry, Lillian murmured. Franklin nodded acknowledgement. Ma went back east after that. Couldn't stand the emptiness, sold the horses, used the money to buy cattle instead. Less attractive to raiders. He looked at her directly. You should know relations with the tribes are better now, but this land has seen blood. Most land has, Lillian replied quietly. Even Boston was built on someone else's home. Something in Franklin's expression shifted, as if he were reassessing her. Most folks who come west don't see it that way. My father taught me that history isn't always what's written in books. Lillian smiled faintly. He was considered quite radical in his views. And you? What are your views, Miss Walker? The question seemed to carry more weight than casual conversation. Lillian chose her words carefully. I believe in treating all people with dignity. I believe in working hard and living honestly. She met his gaze. And I believe that sometimes we must leave the familiar behind to find where we truly belong. Franklin studied her for a long moment. That's a good philosophy for the frontier. He stood abruptly. I need to check on the horses. You should rest more. As he bundled up to face the cold, Lillian called after him. Frank, he paused at the door. In your letters, you spoke of wanting children someday. Do you still... One step at a time, Miss Walker, he said, his voice suddenly gruff. Let's see if you even want to stay once you see what you've gotten yourself into. The door closed behind him with finality, leaving Lillian to wonder at the pain she'd glimpsed in his eyes at the mention of children. The next day dawned clear and blindingly bright, the sun reflecting off snow that blanketed the landscape as far as the eye could see. Lillian stood outside the cabin, bundled in layers of clothing Franklin had provided, marveling at the untouched white expanse. It's beautiful, she breathed, her words forming clouds in the frigid air. It's deadly, Franklin corrected, securing their belongings to his horse. Beauty and danger often go hand in hand out here. He helped her mount, then swung up behind her as he had the first night. The shared saddle meant Lillian was cradled between his arms, her back pressed against his chest. Despite the layers between them, she felt the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. They rode in silence, the only sounds the crunch of snow beneath the horse's hooves and the occasional distant call of a bird. After nearly an hour, they crested a ridge, and Franklin pulled the horse to a stop. There, he said, his voice close to her ear. That's home. Below them stretched a small valley sheltered by hills. A sturdy two-story house of hewn logs stood near a cluster of cottonwood trees, flanked by a large barn and several outbuildings. A creek, partially frozen, curved through pasture land, where dark shapes cattle huddled together for warmth. It's larger than I expected, Lillian said, taking in the scope of the ranch. Built it with expansion in mind. Franklin clicked the horse forward. Thought I'd have a family to fill it by now. The simple statement carried years of loneliness, and Lillian's heart ached for this man who had carved out a place for a dream that hadn't yet materialized. As they approached the house, smoke curled from the chimney. "Someone's here?" Lillian asked, suddenly nervous. "Mrs. Abernathy from town," Franklin explained. "Comes by once a week to help with washing and such. Sent word with her husband before the storm that I'd be bringing a bride back." He hesitated. "Hope that's all right." "Of course," she replied, though the word bride sent a flutter of anxiety through her chest. The main house was rustic, but surprisingly comfortable. Wide plank floors were softened by braided rugs. The main room held a large stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 6 chairs, and several well-made pieces of furniture. Curtains framed the windows, and kerosene lamps sat on tables alongside a few books. It wasn't fancy, but it was far from primitive. Mrs. Abernathy, a robust woman in her 60s with kind eyes and work-worn hands, greeted them at the door. "Thank the Lord you're both safe," she exclaimed. "When that storm hit, I feared the worst." She looked Lillian up and down. "So you're the mail-order bride. Got here just in time to nearly freeze to death, I hear." "Yes, madam," Lillian replied, uncertain how to respond to the woman's directness. "Well, you look half-starved and completely exhausted. Come in, come in. I've got stew on the stove and fresh bread in the oven." Franklin touched Lillian's elbow lightly. "Mrs. Abernathy has been a godsend since I lost my mother. Knows more about this territory than anyone." "Been here since '52, the older woman confirmed, ushering them inside. "Came with my first husband, God rest his soul. Lost him to Blackfoot Raiders in '59. Married Mr. Abernathy in '61. She paused, looking between them. "When's the wedding to be?" "Then?" Franklin cleared his throat. "We haven't, that is. We're getting to know one another first," Lillian interjected smoothly. "After all, letters can only tell you so much." Mrs. Abernathy nodded approvingly. "Smart girl, though don't wait too long. Winter's a lonely time without a proper spouse." She bustled toward the kitchen. "I've aired out the spare bedroom for you, Miss Walker. Made up fresh sheets and everything." Relief washed over Lillian at the confirmation she wouldn't be expected to share Franklin's bed immediately. Their arrangement was practical, but she wasn't prepared to become a wife in every sense without at least some time to know the man. After a hearty meal, Mrs. Abernathy departed with promises to return the following week. As the door closed behind her, silence descended on the house. Lillian stood awkwardly in the main room, acutely aware of being alone with Franklin for the first time in what was now supposed to be their shared home. "You must be tired," he said finally. "I'll show you to your room." He led her upstairs to a small but pleasant bedroom with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a rocking chair near the window that overlooked the valley. "It was my mother's sewing room," he explained. "Not much, but it's private." "It's lovely," Lillian said sincerely. "Thank you." Franklin hovered in the doorway. "My room's at the end of the hall if you need anything. There's a washroom between. I'll bring up some hot water for you." As he turned to leave, Lillian called after him. "Frank," he paused, "I know this isn't how either of us imagined our first meeting would go, but I want you to know I intend to honor our agreement. I'm here to be your wife and partner in building this ranch." She took a deep breath. "I just need a little time to adjust." Franklin studied her, his expression unreadable. "Take all the time you need, Lillian. I ain't in any hurry." Later, clean and changed into a nightgown retrieved from her trunk that had been delivered from the station, Lillian sat on the edge of the bed and opened her mother's Bible. A letter fell out, the last one Franklin had sent, confirming her arrival date. She read it again, comparing the measured, thoughtful words on the page with the reserved man who had saved her life. "Dear Miss Walker," it began, "I am pleased to hear you have decided to accept my proposal. I believe we can build a good life together here. The land is demanding but generous to those who respect it. I cannot offer luxury, but I promise honesty, fidelity, and protection. I will work every day to provide a comfortable home for you and any children we might be blessed with." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. What had she done, traveling across the country to marry a stranger? Yet, as she thought of Franklin, his quiet strength, his capable hands, The way he'd carried her through the storm, without hesitation, she felt a flutter of something that might, with time, grow into affection. Setting the Bible aside, Lillian extinguished the lamp and slipped beneath the covers. Outside, wind whistled around the eaves of the house, but inside, she was warm and safe. It wasn't Boston, and Franklin Lawson wasn't the husband she'd imagined for herself growing up, but perhaps this rugged land and this solemn man were exactly what she needed after all. The following weeks established a cautious rhythm between them. Franklin rose before dawn each day to tend to the cattle and the handful of horses he kept for ranch work. Lillian took charge of the household, learning the peculiarities of cooking on a wood stove and managing provisions that had to last through a long winter. Their interactions were polite but reserved, each carefully maintaining boundaries as they circled around the eventual purpose of Lillian's presence. At night, they would sit by the fire, Franklin often cleaning tack or mending equipment, while Lillian sewed or read aloud from one of the few books in the house. Sometimes he would tell her stories of the land, of the people who had lived there before, of the dreams he had for expanding the ranch. Gradually, Lillian began venturing outside, bundled against the cold. She learned to collect eggs from the small chicken coop, to milk the cow Franklin kept for household use, and to navigate the snowy path between the house and the barn. The work was harder than anything she'd done in Boston, but there was satisfaction in mastering each new skill. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after their arrival at the main house, Lillian decided to bring Franklin lunch in the barn, where he was repairing a broken stall. As she approached, she heard voices and paused, not wanting to interrupt if he had a visitor. "You ain't said nothing about when you're getting hitched," a male voice was saying. "Mrs. Abernathy's been telling everyone in town you've got a mail-order bride living here, but no wedding date." "It's complicated, Sheriff," Franklin replied, his tone neutral. "We're taking time to be sure." "Sure about what?" "Woman traveled across the country to marry you. What more you need to know? Whether she can handle frontier life, whether she'll be happy here." The sheriff laughed. "Since when does a woman's happiness factor into these arrangements? You needed a wife to help with the ranch. She needed security. That's the bargain, ain't it?" There was a long pause before Franklin spoke, his voice low and intense. "My mother was miserable here for 20 years before my father died. Hated every day of it. Made him miserable too. I won't do that to Lillian or myself." The words hit Lillian like a physical blow. She hadn't considered that Franklin might be as uncertain about their arrangement as she was. "Well," the sheriff said, his tone softer, "that's mighty considerate of you, Frank. But don't wait too long. People talk, and a woman living unchaperoned with a man. I know." Franklin sounded weary. "We'll figure it out soon." Lillian retreated silently, returning to the house with the lunch basket. Her mind whirled with this new insight into Franklin's hesitation. When he returned to the house an hour later, she was kneading bread dough with unusual vigor. "Sheriff Daniels stopped by," Franklin said, hanging his coat by the door. "Said to extend his greetings to you." Lillian kept her eyes on the dough. "Did he come all this way just to be neighborly?" "Mostly." Franklin hesitated. "Also wanted to know when we're getting married." Her hands stilled. "And what did you tell him?" "That it's between us and not the business of the entire territory." He moved to the basin to wash his hands. "But he has a point. Your reputation—" "I'm not concerned about gossip," Lillian interrupted, resuming her kneading. "I'm more concerned about marrying a man I'm still getting to know." Franklin dried his hands on a towel, watching her work the dough. "You have flour on your cheek," he said softly. Before she could react, he reached out and gently brushed it away, his fingers rough, but his touch careful. The brief contact sent warmth spreading through her. "Would you like to go for a ride tomorrow?" he asked, breaking the moment. "Weather's supposed to be mild. Thought you might like to see more of the ranch." Lillian smiled, surprised by the invitation. "I'd like that very much." The next day dawned clear, and, as Franklin had predicted, unusually mild for January. After breakfast, he saddled 2 horses his own sturdy gelding and a smaller, gentle mare he'd been training. "You ever ridden before?" he asked as he helped Lillian mount. "Only in the park in Boston," she admitted. "And side saddle at that." Franklin adjusted the stirrups for her. "Daisy here's steady as they come. Just hold the reins lightly and follow my lead." They rode at a leisurely pace, Franklin pointing out landmarks and boundaries. He showed her where he planned to expand the pastures. Come spring, the site where he hoped to build a larger barn, the spot near the creek where wild strawberries grew in summer. It's all so vast, Lillian marveled as they stopped on a ridge overlooking the valley. In Boston, you can hardly turn around without bumping into someone. Here, it feels like you could ride for days and never see another soul. That's the appeal for some, Franklin said, dismounting to let his horse drink from a small spring that hadn't completely frozen over. And the terror for others. Lillian slid carefully from her saddle, wincing at the stiffness in her legs. Which is it for you? Franklin considered the question, squinting against the sun. Both, I reckon. I love the freedom, the space to breathe, but there are times when the silence gets so loud it nearly deafens you. He glanced at her. What about you? Is the emptiness too much? She looked out across the snow-covered landscape, searching her feelings. I thought it would be, but there's something honest about it. The city has too many distractions, too much artifice. Here, everything is exactly what it appears to be. A smile, the first genuine one she'd seen, transformed Franklin's face. That's it exactly. No pretenses out here. Just you against the elements and, hopefully, a few good people at your side. The ride back was more relaxed, their conversation flowing more easily. Franklin told her about his childhood on the ranch, about learning to track from a Shoshone man who had worked for his father, about his first cattle drive at 15. What about you? He asked as they approached the barn. What was life like in Boston? Lillian described her childhood in the boarding house, helping her mother serve meals to the lodgers, learning to keep accounts from her father, the books she'd devoured in every spare moment. Why did you answer my advertisement? Franklin asked suddenly. A woman with your education could have found work as a teacher or companion. The directness of the question caught her off guard. After my parents died of influenza last winter, I had few options. The boarding house went to pay my father's debts. I could have become a servant or taken one of my cousin's charity and lived as his dependent. She lifted her chin. I preferred independence. Even if it meant marrying a stranger? Even then. She met his gaze steadily. Your letters showed a thoughtful, honorable man. I decided I'd rather take a chance on building something real with someone like you than accept the limitations Boston offered me. Franklin dismounted and came to help her down. His hands spanned her waist, strong and sure, as he lifted her from the saddle. When her feet touched the ground, he didn't immediately step back. They stood close, his hands still at her waist. Her face tilted up to his. And now that you're here, he asked, his voice low, do you regret your decision? Lillian should have been intimidated by his nearness, by the intensity in his blue eyes, but instead, she felt a strange sense of rightness. No, she whispered. I don't regret it at all. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. His gaze dropped to her lips, and his hands tightened slightly at her waist. But then he stepped back, the moment breaking like ice on a spring creek. We should get these horses rubbed down before the temperature drops, he said, his voice carefully neutral. That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Franklin cleared his throat. Been thinking about what the sheriff said? He looked uncomfortable but determined. Maybe we should set a date for the wedding. Lillian set aside her sewing. Is that what you want? It's what makes sense, he hedged. That's not what I asked. Franklin stared into the fire. I want you to be sure, Lillian. Marriage out here, it's not something you can easily undo if you change your mind. I know that. She studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the furrow between his brows. But it goes both ways, Frank. Are you sure about me? His eyes met hers. I knew from your third letter that you were different. You wrote about wanting to see the stars without city smoke dimming them, about not minding hard work if it built something worthwhile. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Most women who answer advertisements like mine are desperate or delusional about frontier life. You seemed clear-eyed. I try to be, Lillian said softly. The Reverend comes through town first Sunday of each month, Franklin continued. That's 10 days from now. If you're willing, we could be married then. If you need more time. 10 days is fine, she interrupted, surprising herself with her certainty. We may not have a conventional courtship, but I believe we can build a good life together, Frank. I wouldn't have come all this way if I didn't." Relief and something warmer flickered in his eyes. "All right then. February 4th it is." As the wedding date approached, activity at the ranch intensified. Franklin rode into town twice, once to speak with the Reverend, and once to order supplies for what he insisted would be a proper celebration, even if it was small. "No wife of mine is getting married without a cake and a new dress," he declared, when Lillian protested the expense. "I may not be a rich man, but I can afford to do this right." Mrs. Abernathy arrived 3 days before the wedding, laden with fabric and sewing notions. "Can't have you getting married in your traveling clothes," she announced, immediately taking Lillian's measurements. "Good thing you're not too short or too tall. We can alter my daughter's wedding dress. She married a shopkeeper in Denver last year." The older woman worked with remarkable speed, transforming a slightly outdated gown of ivory satin into something simple but elegant. As Lillian stood for the final fitting, Mrs. Abernathy stepped back with a satisfied nod. "Franklin won't know what hit him when he sees you in this," she declared. "Man's been alone too long. Does him good to have a woman's touch around the place." She pinned a section of lace at the collar. "I know it ain't my business, but has he told you about his first fiancé yet?" Lillian stilled. "First fiancé?" Mrs. Abernathy's hands paused. "Oh, lands, I thought you knew. It was 5 years ago now." "What happened?" Lillian asked, her throat suddenly dry. The older woman sighed, resuming her work. Her name was Rebecca, daughter of a rancher over in Green River. Beautiful girl, sweet disposition. They were to be married that spring. She shook her head sadly. Influenza took her, along with her mother and younger brother. Hit that family hard and fast. Lillian's heart ached for Franklin's loss. He never mentioned her. Man doesn't talk about his pain much, just carries it. Mrs. Abernathy secured the last pin. "That's why I was so pleased when I heard he'd finally decided to advertise for a wife. Thought he'd never get past losing Rebecca." The revelation explained so much: Franklin's hesitation, his concern about her commitment, his reluctance to rush into marriage despite their agreement. He wasn't just cautious about bringing a city woman to a frontier ranch. He was protecting himself from another devastating loss. That evening, when Franklin returned from checking the cattle, Lillian had dinner waiting: venison stew with dumplings, one of his favorites that Mrs. Abernathy had taught her to make. "Smells good," he said, washing up at the basin. "Mrs. Abernathy head back to town already?" "Yes, she finished the alterations on the dress." Lillian placed a basket of bread on the table. "She told me about Rebecca." Franklin froze, water dripping from his hands. Slowly he reached for the towel. "She had no right to do that." "Perhaps not," Lillian agreed quietly. "But I'm glad she did. It helps me understand you better." He turned to face her, his expression guarded. "What's to understand? I was engaged. She died. End of story." "It's not the end, though, is it?" Lillian stepped closer. "It's part of who you are, part of why you waited 5 years to seek another wife." Franklin's jaw tightened. "This isn't something I want to talk about." "I know," Lillian said gently. "But we're to be married in 3 days. There shouldn't be ghosts between us, Frank." He moved to the window, staring out at the darkening landscape. "It was a long time ago." "Not so long," she followed, standing just behind him. "You loved her." "I did." His shoulders sagged slightly. "We grew up together. Everybody just assumed we'd get married someday. And then she was gone, just like that. 3 days from healthy to dead." Lillian's hand hovered above his shoulder before settling gently. "I'm so sorry, Frank. After that, I threw myself into the ranch, expanded the herd, built the new barn, added on to the house." He turned to face her, his eyes shadowed. "Thought maybe if I made it successful enough, big enough, it would fill the emptiness. It didn't. And that's when you decided to advertise for a wife." He nodded. "Practical decision. Ranch this size needs a woman's touch, children to pass it on to eventually." A muscle worked in his jaw. "Didn't expect to feel anything beyond respect and companionship. Didn't want to." The implication hung between them that despite his intentions, feelings were developing. Lillian's heart beat faster. "And now?" she asked softly. Franklin reached out slowly, his calloused fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face. Now, I'm standing here thinking I'm the luckiest fool in Wyoming territory, getting a second chance I didn't even know I wanted. The kiss, when it came, was gentle a question rather than a demand. Lillian answered by stepping closer, her hands coming to rest on his chest as his arms encircled her waist. When they finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against his shoulder. "I'm not Rebecca," she whispered. "I can't replace what you lost. I don't want you to." Franklin's voice was rough with emotion. "You're Lillian, stubborn, brave, far too educated for a simple rancher, and exactly what I need." They stood like that for a long moment, the stew forgotten as they embraced the possibility of a future neither had imagined when they began their correspondence. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the February sun casting long shadows across the pristine snow. Guests began arriving mid-morning, neighboring ranchers and their wives, the sheriff and his family, the storekeeper from town, and a handful of others who had become Franklin's friends over the years. Mrs. Abernathy took charge of transforming the main room into a space worthy of a wedding, arranging evergreen boughs and red berries, setting out the good china Franklin's mother had left behind, and orchestrating the preparation of a feast that would feed 20 people. Upstairs, Lillian dressed with trembling hands. The ivory gown fit perfectly, the alterations making it seem as if it had been made for her all along. She pinned her hair up, securing it with the pearl combs that had been her mother's, and added a touch of rosewater to her wrists and throat. A knock at the door revealed Franklin's closest neighbor, Thomas Edwards, a gruff older man who had arrived with his wife earlier that morning. "Miss Walker," he said, removing his hat. "Frank asked me to give you this." He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. "And to tell you, there's still time to change your mind if you've come to your senses." He winked to show he was joking. Alone again, Lillian unwrapped the package to find a delicate gold locket. Inside was a tiny pressed wildflower, a perfect mountain bluebell. A note in Franklin's neat handwriting accompanied it. "Lillian, this flower grows on the highest ridge of our land, blooming brave and beautiful despite harsh conditions. It reminded me of you. I'll show you where they grow when spring comes. Until then, carry this as a promise that, with you, I look forward to all the seasons to come. Yours, Franklin." Tears threatened to ruin the coal. Mrs. Bristow. Abernathy had carefully applied to Lillian's lashes. She blinked them away, fastening the locket around her neck with fingers that shook slightly. Then, taking a deep breath, she opened the door to begin her new life. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. The Reverend, a kindly man with white hair and weathered skin, spoke of partnership and perseverance, of building a life strong enough to withstand the storms of the frontier. Franklin, clean-shaven and dressed in a new shirt and his best trousers, spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice that carried to the farthest corner of the room. When it was Lillian's turn, she looked into his eyes, those intense blue eyes that had first peered at her through a blizzard, and made her promises without hesitation. The matching gold band Franklin placed on her finger had belonged to his mother. He'd told her the night before, but had never been worn with resentment or regret. "It will have a happier history with you," he'd said. After the ceremony came the celebration, a feast of venison, ham, chicken, and every side dish the women of the community could conjure from winter stores. There was dancing to the music of a fiddle and harmonica, laughter and stories, and generous toasts to the new couple's health and happiness. The cake Mrs. Abernathy had baked was a triumph of ingenuity given the limited ingredients available, and Franklin insisted on saving the top tier for our first anniversary, he murmured in Lillian's ear, causing her to blush. As evening approached, the guests gradually departed, mindful of the distance to their own homes and the early nightfall of winter. By sunset, only Mrs. Abernathy remained, and she too was preparing to leave, bundled into a wagon with her husband. "Don't worry about cleaning up," she instructed as she hugged Lillian goodbye. "That can wait till tomorrow, or the next day." She winked broadly. "You two have more important matters to attend to." Franklin laughed at Lillian's embarrassed expression and shook Mr. Abernathy's hand. "Thank you both for everything. We couldn't have managed such a fine wedding without you." As the last wagon disappeared down the snow-packed road, Franklin and Lillian stood together on the porch, his arm around her waist. "Well, Mrs. Lawson," he said, the name still new and wondrous on his tongue, "shall we go inside? It's getting cold out here." The intimacy that followed was tender and unhurried. Franklin proved to be as considerate a lover as he was a man, patient with Lillian's inexperience and attuned to her responses. What began with nervous anticipation transformed into a deep connection that transcended the physical, leaving them both breathless with the discovery of each other. Afterward, lying in his arms, their arms now, Lillian traced the scar that ran along his ribs, a souvenir from a fight with a cornered wolf, he'd explained. "Happy?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. "Very," she replied, nestling closer. "Though I'm realizing this is just the beginning. There's so much more to learn about each other." Franklin kissed the top of her head. "We have time, all the seasons to come. Remember?" "I remember." Lillian smiled against his chest. "I want to see the bluebells in spring. And the wildfire sunsets in summer," he added. "The aspen trees turning gold in fall, the first snow blanketing everything in winter." "Is it always so beautiful here?" she asked. "Not always," he admitted. "Sometimes it's brutal, droughts that crack the earth, blizzards that bury the weak, floods that wash away everything you've built." His arms tightened around her. "But there's beauty in surviving those things, too, in building something that lasts despite them." Lillian understood then what he was really saying, that life together wouldn't always be as perfect as this moment, but that facing hardships side by side would strengthen rather than diminish what they were creating. "I'm not afraid of the hard times," she whispered. "Not with you." Spring arrived late that year, teasing with mild days followed by sudden freezes that delayed the greening of the land. By April, Lillian had settled fully into her role as mistress of the ranch. She managed the household with increasing confidence, learning the rhythms of frontier life and adapting her Boston skills to new challenges. Franklin found himself watching her with growing admiration, the way she tackled each new task with determination, her unexpected strength, the intelligence she brought to everything from planning provisions to helping with the ranch accounts. They worked well together, their strengths complementing each other in ways neither had anticipated. One evening in late April, Franklin returned from checking fence lines to find Lillian sitting on the porch, a letter in her hand. "News from home?" he asked, settling beside her on the bench. "From my cousin in Boston," she confirmed. "He's still offering me a place in his household if frontier life proves too difficult." A smile played at her lips. "He seems to think I'm one harsh winter away from begging to return east." Franklin's heart skipped a beat. "And are you?" She turned to him, surprise evident in her expression. "Of course not. This is my home now." She took his hand, her fingers warm against his. "You are my home." Relief washed through him. "Good, because I've grown rather accustomed to having you around, Mrs. Lawson." "Is that so, Mr. Lawson?" Her eyes sparkled with mischief. "Just accustomed?" Franklin pulled her closer. "Maybe a bit more than that," he conceded, before capturing her lips in a kiss that left no doubt about his feelings. When they separated, Lillian rested her head against his shoulder. "I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made Franklin pull back to study her face. "What is it?" "I think—" She placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "I'm almost certain we're going to have a baby. Come winter." Franklin stared at her, stunned into silence. Then a smile broke across his face, wider and more joyful than any expression Lillian had yet seen from him. "A baby," he repeated, his voice hushed with wonder. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be. Mrs. Abernathy confirmed my suspicions when she visited last week." Franklin stood abruptly, pulling Lillian to her feet and spinning her in a circle before setting her down carefully, as if she might break. "We have to be careful now. You shouldn't be doing heavy work. I'll hire someone to help with—" "Frank," Lillian interrupted, laughing, "I'm with child, not made of glass. Women have been having babies on the frontier since the first settlers arrived. I'll be fine." He sobered, cupping her face in his hands. "I know, but you're precious to me, Lillian. You and this baby, you're everything I never thought I'd have again." The naked vulnerability in his eyes moved her deeply. "We're not going anywhere," she promised. "This child will grow up strong and free on this land, with parents who love each other and him or her. As May unfolded into June, the ranch bloomed with new life. Calves frolicked in the pastures, wildflowers carpeted the hills, and the creek ran full and clear with snowmelt from the mountains. True to his promise, Franklin took Lillian to see the bluebells on the high ridge, carefully guiding her horse along the steep trail. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined," Lillian breathed, taking in the vista of their land spread out below, the sea of delicate blue flowers nodding in the breeze around them. Franklin watched her instead of the view, memorizing the way the sun caught the auburn highlights in her hair, the curve of her smile, the gentle swell beginning at her waistline. "I never thought I could be this happy again," he confessed. "After Rebecca died, I convinced myself that contentment was the best I could hope for. That love like that comes once, if you're lucky." Lillian turned to him, her eyes soft with understanding. "And now? Now I know better." He moved his horse closer to hers, reaching across to take her hand. "What I feel for you isn't a replacement for what I lost. It's its own thing, deeper in some ways, because I know how precious and fragile life can be. I wish I could have known you then," Lillian said, "but I'm grateful for the man those experiences shaped." Franklin squeezed her hand. "I've been thinking about names for the baby. If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after my father, James." "James Lawson," Lillian repeated. "It's a good, strong name, and if it's a girl—" "I thought perhaps after your mother? You've spoken so fondly of her." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes. Eleanor Lawson. It's perfect." The summer months brought their own challenges, a drought that threatened the hay crop, a mountain lion that killed 3 calves before Franklin and a neighboring rancher tracked and shot it, and the increasing discomfort of pregnancy in the heat. But there were joys too, the completion of the nursery Franklin built adjoining their bedroom, the arrival of a letter from Mrs. Abernathy's daughter in Denver containing patterns for baby clothes, the first fluttering movements of new life that Lillian guided Franklin's hand to feel. "He's strong," Franklin marveled after feeling a particularly vigorous kick. "Takes after his mother." "Or she takes after her father," Lillian countered with a smile. By August, Lillian's condition was obvious, her movements slower, but her spirits high. Franklin hired a young man from town to help with the heavier ranch work, freeing him to spend more time close to home as Lillian's time approached. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Franklin brought out a small wooden box. "I've been working on this in the evenings," he explained, opening it to reveal a delicate wooden rattle, smooth and perfectly balanced. "My father made one for me, and his father for him." Lillian ran her fingers over the fine craftsmanship. "It's beautiful. Frank, there's something else." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. "I had the lawyer in town draw this up last time I was there." Lillian unfolded the paper. "A deed?" "I've put the ranch in both our names," Franklin explained. "Equal partners in everything. If anything happens to me, you and the baby will be secure." Tears filled Lillian's eyes. "Nothing is going to happen to you?" "Probably not," he agreed, brushing a tear from her cheek. "But a man thinks differently when he has a family to protect. I want to make sure you're provided for, no matter what." Lillian leaned into his embrace. "When I answered your advertisement, I thought I was agreeing to a practical arrangement security in exchange for my work and companionship. I never expected—" She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I never expected to find love, Frank. Real love." "Neither did I," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Thought that part of my life was over. You proved me wrong, Lillian Lawson, and I've never been happier to be wrong in my life." When the first snow of winter dusted the ground in early November, Lillian felt the first pains begin. Mrs. Abernathy had been staying with them for a week, preparing for the birth, and she took charge immediately. "First babies often take their time," she assured Franklin as he paced outside the bedroom. "Could be hours yet." But James Franklin Lawson had other ideas, arriving just after midnight with a robust cry that brought tears to his father's eyes when he was finally allowed into the room. The baby had Lillian's auburn hair and Franklin's blue eyes, a perfect combination of them both. "He's perfect," Franklin whispered, cradling his son with hands that dwarfed the tiny body. "You're perfect." Both of you. Exhausted but radiant, Lillian watched the man she'd married less than a year ago, the man she'd known only through letters before traveling west, tenderly holding their child. The journey that had begun in a deadly blizzard had led to this moment of perfect contentment, this family they'd created together. "I love you," she said simply. Franklin looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "And I love you more than I have words to express." Outside, snow began falling in earnest, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. But inside, by the warmth of the fire, the Lawson family was complete, the mail-order bride who had shivered in the storm, the cowboy who had carried her toward fire and forever, and the child who represented their shared future on the frontier they both now called home. 5 years later. Spring 1882. The bluebells carpeted the high ridge in a sea of delicate color, dancing in the spring breeze. Lillian Lawson spread a quilt beneath a young cottonwood tree and settled herself upon it, watching as her husband chased their giggling 4-year-old son through the flowers. "Careful near the edge, James," she called, instinctively placing a protective hand on her rounded belly, where their second child, the daughter they had longed for, had been making her presence known with increasingly vigorous movements for the past several months. "I've got him," Franklin assured her, scooping the boy up and swinging him onto his shoulders. "He's getting too fast for his old pa to keep up with." "Not old," James protested, patting his father's head. "Just slow." Franklin laughed, the sound carrying across the ridge. At 35, he was in his prime. The past 5 years of happiness had erased the shadows from his eyes and softened the hard lines of his face. His hair was still thick and brown, though Lillian had recently discovered a single silver strand at his temple that she secretly found distinguished. "Are you comfortable?" Franklin asked as he joined her on the quilt, setting James down to explore a nearby patch of wildflowers under their watchful eyes. "The ride wasn't too much?" "I'm fine," Lillian assured him, leaning into his embrace. "Eleanor seems to enjoy the motion, actually. She's been dancing ever since we left the house." Franklin placed his hand on her belly, his touch still sending warmth through her after all this time. "She's strong, like her mama, and stubborn, like her papa." Lillian covered his hand with her own. "Mrs. Abernathy says she'll arrive before the summer heat, which would be a blessing." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their son carefully collecting flowers in his small hands. The Lawson ranch had prospered over the past 5 years. The cattle herd had doubled, and Franklin had added sheep after Lillian suggested diversifying their livestock. The main house had been expanded again to accommodate their growing family, and they'd built a small schoolhouse that served neighboring ranches as well, with Lillian teaching reading and arithmetic 3 days a week. "I received a letter from my cousin yesterday," Lillian said, breaking the silence. "He's finally stopped asking when I'm returning to Boston." Franklin chuckled. "Only took him 5 years to accept that you're a Western woman now." "Indeed." She tilted her face up to the spring sunshine. "I can hardly remember the girl who arrived on that train, terrified and out of her depth." "I remember her," Franklin said softly. "Brave enough to face a blizzard, stubborn enough to survive it, beautiful enough to stop my heart when I found her in the snow." Lillian blushed. Still susceptible to his compliments after all this time. "If I recall correctly, you weren't exactly forthcoming with such sweet talk back then. Was too busy making sure you didn't die of exposure?" He pressed a kiss to her temple. "And too afraid to admit, even to myself, that I'd started falling in love with you from the moment I carried you through that storm." "Papa! Mama! Look!" James came running toward them, his hands filled with bluebells. "For the baby sister!" Lillian accepted the slightly crushed flowers with appropriate admiration. "They're beautiful, James. We'll press some in a book for Eleanor to see when she's born." "Can I feel her kick again?" the boy asked, his blue eyes so like his father's wide with wonder. "Of course." Lillian guided his small hand to a spot where the baby was particularly active. When he felt the movement, his face lit up with delight. "She's saying hello," he exclaimed. "I think she is," Franklin agreed, his arm tightening around Lillian's shoulders. Later, as they rode home at a leisurely pace, James securely in front of his father, on one horse, Lillian carefully mounted on her gentle mare, Franklin pointed to the land spread out below them. "I was thinking," he said casually, "that we might build another cabin near the south pasture." "Oh?" Lillian raised an eyebrow. "Are you planning to expand the herd again?" "Not exactly." He gave her a sidelong glance. "The Wallace family lost everything in that fire last month. Tom's a good man, and Sarah's handy with livestock. Thought they might want to work our land in exchange for a place to live, share in the profits." Lillian smiled, her heart swelling with pride in the man she'd married. "That's a wonderful idea, Frank." "Learn from the best," he replied, his eyes warm as they met hers. "You're the one who taught me that building something worthwhile means bringing others along with you." The ranch house came into view as they descended from the ridge, solid, welcoming. The vegetable garden Lillian had established already showing green shoots, smoke rising from the chimney where Mrs. Peterson, their part-time housekeeper, would be preparing dinner. It was a far cry from the primitive cabin where they'd spent their first days together, or even from the house as it had been when Lillian first arrived. "Remember when you asked if I regretted my decision to come west?" Lillian asked as they approached. Franklin nodded, helping her down from her horse with careful hands. "I think about that moment often," she continued, keeping her voice low so James wouldn't hear as he ran ahead to the house. "How close we came to never finding this happiness. If the train had arrived on the right day, if there hadn't been a blizzard. If you hadn't been the most determined woman in Wyoming territory, walking into a snowstorm rather than waiting sensibly at the station," Franklin teased, though his eyes were serious. "Providence," Lillian said, echoing the word he'd used that first night in the line shack. "That's what you called it then, and I still believe it." He drew her close, one hand cradling her belly between them. "Some things are meant to be, Lillian. You and me, this family, this life we've built." As the setting sun bathed their home in golden light, Lillian stood on tiptoe to kiss her husband, the man who had once been just a name on paper, who had carried her from the deadly cold toward warmth and safety, who had become the center of the life she could never have imagined when she boarded that train in Boston 5 years ago. "I love you, Franklin Lawson," she whispered against his lips. "And I love you, Lillian Lawson," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. "Today, tomorrow, and all the seasons to come." Hand in hand, they walked toward home, toward the future they continued to build. Together, a future as vast and promising as the western sky above them, as enduring as the land beneath their feet, as warm as the fire that had first drawn them together on that stormy winter night.